It's no secret that Apple taking their entire Macintosh lineup and moving it from Intel to Apple Silicon came with a ton of benefits, including power efficiency, battery life, thermals, and design flexibility now that the systems are so much more thermally and power efficient. But something that nobody's really talking about is the one big thing that Apple has now lost in their ecosystem by moving away from Intel. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I also want to ask the question, is it worth buying an Intel Mac in 2023? So let's talk about it. So of course, when Apple launched their Apple Silicon lineup, I, along with many other reviewers on YouTube, were raving about the benefits, the performance, the snappiness, everything that the M1 and by extension the entire Apple Silicon platform brought to these new Macs. And rightly so, these are extremely impressive machines. And to really understand why these are as impressive as they are, we need to take a look at what Apple was doing just before the transition and why they transitioned. So if you followed this channel for a while, you'll know that the Mac that I had before I moved over to Apple Silicon was an i9 MacBook Pro from 2015. And boy, howdy, did I have tons of issues with that. A lot of them revolved around, of course, the keyboard, but that's like saying the sky's blue. If you owned a MacBook with the butterfly keys, you had key issues. If you look out at the sky, it's blue. But the other issue I had with it was the fact that the thermals were terrible whenever I would actually do any sort of heavy lifting later on in the computer's life. Of course, early on I didn't have those issues because, well, I wasn't doing nearly as much work, but as I started doing more heavy lifting, the system just bogged down because it was getting hotter and hotter and throttling, and there were entire videos dedicated to showing that the i7 version of these MacBooks were running better than the i9s because of those thermal issues. So Apple was making their devices thinner and thinner, and Intel was making their systems more and more power hungry, thus making more and more heat. And this isn't the first time that Apple has done this. In fact, if we look all the way back at 2005 through 6, Apple transitioned their entire lineup from PowerPC to Intel for the exact same reasons. But at the time that Apple decided to move from PowerPC to Intel, this was the first time Apple had actually ever ran their systems with an x86 architecture. See, before this, Apple was only using their Motorola chips, and then after that, they transitioned to PowerPC. These were RISC-based architecture, and that's the same architecture that these new ARM-based Apple Silicon chips run on. Now, RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set, and the benefit to Reduced Instruction Set is kind of in the name. You're reducing the instruction set. You can get a lot more with a lot less, and that efficiency is what allows these systems to run the way they do. But, of course, with Apple pushing more and more power later in the life of PowerPC, you began to run into higher clock speeds, higher temperatures, and, well, the switch to Intel. Because at the time, x86, Intel's architecture, also known as CISC or Complex Instruction Set, seemed to be, or actually just generally was, better in terms of power, efficiency, and performance. But not only did moving to x86 mean that Apple had a more powerful and power-efficient platform to work off of, but it also meant that there was a benefit that Apple really didn't start leveraging until a little after the transition was complete, and that was a much broader level of hardware compatibility. See, x86 might sound familiar to some of you who are a little more tech inclined. You've watched a few Linus Tech Tips videos or read the specs sheets of Intel or AMD processors, because x86 is the most commonly used architecture on the consumer computer market. And Apple, in 2006, moved their platform to that architecture. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means with the right drivers, you can run Windows natively on the hardware of a Mac because it's running an Intel chip. A PC uses an Intel chip. It's literally the same chip, just packaged in aluminum instead of plastic, or given a black motherboard and a nice display and an Apple logo versus being given a reasonable display wrapped in plastic with a Lenovo logo on it. See, from 2006 till 2020, Apple was essentially making PCs that were running macOS. This is also why things like Hackintoshes were so much easier to do, because by modifying the drivers of an x86 compiled version of macOS, you could put it onto a PC as long as macOS knew how to function with the hardware that wasn't natively supported in macOS. It was a huge benefit to a lot of people. This led to some really interesting things that people have done with Macs, including somebody I actually know personally buying a Mac Pro, both the trash can, the one before that, and the most recent one, putting a powerful enough graphics card in it to run modern game titles, and booting in Boot Camp into Windows to run these games on the Mac. That's actually a thing you can do. And, well, you can't do that now, like, at all with the new Apple Silicon chips. Now, obviously, gaming is a bit of a niche example because most people don't buy a Mac to game, and even then, the cooling, unless you've got a Mac Pro, is probably not going to be the best to be running your GPU and your CPU at high levels for extended periods of time. But there are other benefits to being able to use your Mac for a couple things here and there, and then boot it up into Windows and use it like a PC for a couple other things. A couple tuning shops that I know who work on cars and tune them have tuning software that is only compiled for Windows. But a lot of them use Macs, so they can boot up into Mac OS, do whatever they need to for their day-to-day, and then when they go to tune a car, they can just boot up into Windows, load up their tuning software, do everything they need to, and then when they're finished, go back into Mac OS and get all the benefits of iCloud and phone syncing with their text messages and all that stuff. The same thing goes for engineering. There are all kinds of engineering practices that require specific software, most of which is compiled for Windows. But I know a few people who are engineers who prefer to use a Mac, and it's just because they either like the hardware or it's what they already have. But with an Intel Mac, they can boot up into Windows, use the hardware they like with the software they need, and then boot back into Mac OS when they just want to do the regular things that they would do in Mac OS. Now, of course, these examples are fairly niche, and for the average consumer, the switch over to the Apple Silicon platform has been nothing but a benefit. I fall into that camp. I have had nothing but pluses to say about the Apple Silicon transition, especially considering where I came from with the poorly performing Intel i9 in the 2015 MacBook Pro. But I fully recognize that there are niche cases where an Intel Mac is definitely still worth buying. And for somebody who falls into that niche case, whether it be an engineer who needs a specific piece of software that only runs on an Intel platform, or somebody who just happens to be a tuner who wants their tuning software and they want to use it on a Mac, or if you're like one of my friends who enjoys gaming on their Mac in boot camp with a powerful enough GPU to run modern titles. Those are the kind of people where the Intel Mac is definitely still a benefit, and the kind of people who are going to be losing that when the full transition to Apple Silicon is completed and the last supported Mac with Intel is finally dropped. Now, of course, there are a few things that we as general consumers have lost during the transition from Intel to Apple Silicon, like compatibility with eGPUs, which still stings because I bought one of those Blackmagic eGPUs for way more than I should have. But overall, it's still fairly niche. And while the compatibility with a broad variety of hardware and software is just gone now, I think that for the average person and even some of the pros, the switch to Apple Silicon is still great. But if you happen to be one of the people who falls into that niche, then yes, especially with the deals you can get now either through Apple's own refurbishing options or through eBay and other sites that sell used Macs, as long as you can still get your hands on one that's compatible with the latest version of macOS, I think that if you have one of those niche use cases, it's definitely still worthwhile. But for most other people, I think the Apple Silicon transition will treat you just fine. Either way, I just wanted to bring this super niche topic to light because I don't see anybody talking about it aside from me and my one friend who we've been talking about niche Mac stuff for years at this point. But I figured I'd bring it to your all's attention and see if you even care. If you do, or if you don't, leave a comment down below. I'll be curious to see what your thoughts are on this really niche topic. And aside from that, make sure to like if you like this video, subscribe if you really like this video and you want to see more stuff like it, and check out my Discord link down below because it is Friday, which means that at 8 p.m. this evening, Eastern Time, we will be doing Funny Friday here and on Twitch. It's going to be a blast. We're going to be watching a ton of memes, and I'm scared. But I hope to see you all there. And aside from that, I hope to see you all in the next video as well. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.